Science, the first dimension of that popular cultural art form, science fiction, explores a series of discourses that are adapted by terraforming stories to inform literary constructions of alien landscapes. SF stories of terraforming allow us to consider how societies view the concept of nature and negotiate their responses to it. The initial motivation to transform alien planets into new Earths puts into play contesting interpretations of ideal relationships to the environment. Science dominates these discussions. Scientific discourse accrues metaphorical implications, often social-political, proper to that second dimension of SF, fiction. The science used in SF offer alternative perspectives on the environment, variously undercutting or contributing to other modes of understanding. Through the course of such narratives, as colonists struggle with notions of naturalization, the feedback between science and non-scientific knowledge generates alternative conceptions of the nature and import of alien environments, forcing us to rethink the concept of nature itself. I examine how science operates in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars and Pamela Sargent's Venus trilogies, with a view to exploring how they engage with the process of coming to terms with the nature of this alien environment, how terraforming is reflected upon as the solution to growing catastrophic climate change or political destabilization, and how these texts critique the way in which nature is itself approached through the contrast of a natural alien landscape to that of an exploited Earth. The environmental philosopher Holmes Rosen III identifies two broad categories of worldview around which debate over the aesthetic appreciation of nature revolves. One, that aesthetic experience must be participatory, relating an actual beholder to the landscape, and the other, that nature is objective to such beholders, actually known in the physical and biological sciences. Considering the question of whether aesthetic appreciation of landscapes needs to be science-based, Rosen compares us various and diverse examples of what he calls pre-scientific approaches to nature, which on the one hand characteristically misunderstand it from the point of view of scientific objectivity, while on the other have developed specific ways of relating to that nature based on human co-adaptation with their environments. Rosen reflects on the assumption that no one appreciates the canyon for what it really is unless helped by geologists, and argues that science cultivates the habits of looking closely, as well as of looking for long periods of time. One is more likely to experience the landscape at multiple scales of both time and space. Nevertheless, he is well aware of the problems of contingency associated with this claim, noting that science and no science, everyone can gain some of that sensitivity. Now, while Sargent and Robinson's trilogies feature many detailed descriptions of geological and climatological processes on Venus and Mars, thus providing the sense of a vast and active planet despite the absence of an indigenous ecology. This scientifically conceived sense of place operates alongside the applied science entailed by terraforming. Planetary engineering involves significant resources to support a highly organized technological adaptation of alien planets. Vast works of engineering are perhaps what SF is popularly known for, and is certainly a distinctive trait of terraforming stories. These texts question whether the advanced technological adaptation of nature is an appropriate way for humanity to relate to their environment. Early in Red Mars, the first novel of the Mars trilogy, Anne Claiborne sees terraforming as imperial in its approach to nature. She completes Sax Russell's claim that deciding to go to Mars is like the first phrase of a sentence, and the whole sentence says, with Veni Vidi Vinci. This sentence, the already familiar narrative of colonization that seems to demand completion in familiar ways, could be considered the political landscape that informs terraforming. Robinson's Mars trilogy attempts to negotiate new relationships to a nature then, already intellectually landscaped with meaning. The terraforming motif is often used to model societies. Malik, a historian in the second novel, Venus of Shadows, believes that the settlements on Venus were experiments, and that the settlers were living in a new environment, and unforeseen problems were bound to surface. Diami and Tio, two children born on Venus, experience these problems as issues related to habitation. Diami tells of his father's description of Earth's sky, something he's never seen, as something like this huge catalogue of the Earth, and Tio complains that it makes it sound like a dome. By connecting a participatory experience of the Earth's biosphere to the Venusian domes, this exchange shows that the model for inhabiting and terraforming Venus revolves around a technological recreation of Earth. Domes are literal necessities for inhabiting Venus's volatile surface, but they also function as loosely self-similar fractal images that mirror Earth at smaller scales, as well as metaphorical experiments that offer ways to scrutinize social, cultural, and political variables that resist isolation. These domes are, at one level, a way to analyze the alien environment from a physically detached and separated objective position. Yet they also shut that alien environment out, excluding it from the colonists' physically experienced sense of place. Although protective, it narrows their imaginative horizons and turns the social experiments inward, toward the exploration of social crises. So in Shadows of Venus, the domes become metaphorical crucibles where a repressive eco-theist cult rises to social dominance and suppresses the population. These crises arise as a consequence of Earth's continuing influence on Venusian culture. This is a quote, Venus seemed nothing more than a vast laboratory to discover if people would willingly become prisoners of the dream of terraforming, to find out if human beings could transform other worlds without losing their ties to the old or shedding their humanity. The problem of developing a new culture on Venus is magnified then when the otherness of the environment is excluded and the aim of the experiment is Earth's continued control over the settlements. Against these social pressures, the appearance of life on Venus's surface becomes an emblem for the limits of political control. In the final novel, Child of Venus, several of the colonists notice something new and unexpected growing from the genetically engineered moss colonizing Venus's surface outside the domes. They reflect how none of their computer models, including the ones that allowed for possible contamination of their equipment, predicted that anything like it would grow from that moss. This challenge to the colonists' expectations, to their view of nature, is accompanied by a literal challenge to social repression embodied by the Havers, a genetically engineered, divergent, and alien human group who reject Earth's politics, government, and history, along with the planetary chauvinism of terraforming and colonizing worlds. They genetically engineer their bodies to adapt themselves to a permanent life in space. The terraforming project on Venus is an interface between these two cultures that evolve unpredictably, mirroring the example of the unanticipated growth of plant life amongst the engineered moss outside the dome. Earth and the Havers' social relations are figured by a biological metaphor. Each culture was a cell, with Venus as the membrane through which molecules from each cell could pass. Without such an exchange, the cells would die. Some of the Havers recognized the necessity of interchange between themselves and Earth, fearing that they would lose that contact with a young, striving culture and become more insular, while Cytherians, the Venusian colonists, dreaming of their future world while trapped behind their domes, might turn on one another again. The cauldron could boil over once more. The Havers' unwillingness to completely break away from Earth and Venus suggests a lack accompanying their rejection of planetary nature. Now, moving on to Robinson's Mars trilogy, this trilogy extends a number of scientists as characters through which the multiple perspectives of the text are focalized. Sax Ross is one of the first 100 scientists sent to colonize, study, and terraform Mars, and he unwillingly develops a reputation among the Terran populace as, quote, the terraformer of Mars, the current living avatar of the great scientist, a very powerful position in Terran culture, something like the Dalai Lama of science, a continuing reincarnation of the embodiment of the spirit of science, created for a culture that only seemed to be able to handle one scientist at a time. Because of his early efforts as head of the terraforming project in pioneering a heavy industrial terraforming model, he is closely aligned with the values linked to applied science as an expression of colonial ideological value. Early in the trilogy, he appears as a caricature of the scientist figure who prefers to separate politics and science. Speaking of instances in which, like the cell culture metaphor discussed before, nature is brought to account for social relations, Sachs argues that I don't think it helps to make analogies between the physical and social worlds. His position is as a Green, advocating Marxist terraforming, is polarized with Anne Claiborne's, a geologist who takes a red, preservationist position, contesting any planetary adaptations. Their fundamental disagreement centers around Sachs's failure, in Anne's view, to see the landscape. His early perception is mediated by a range of scientific apparatus and audiovisual technologies, and he defines Mars's value in terms of its value to the terraforming project. Anne's view, on the other hand, is informed by her scientific awareness of deep geological time and by her experience of this landscape. This opposition reflects Ralston's participatory versus objective view of the environment, with Anne's preferred method of relating to Mars involving long periods of physical exploration, participation with, and perception of Mars. But her experience is also combined with a scientific view, suggesting how just as science can, as Ralston argues, lead to a better appreciation of the environment, something more may be needed, perhaps something that may go beyond science, but which must go through science to go beyond. The problem of developing a sense of place that includes an appreciation of the environment, then, is a perceptual issue, and science remains a powerful tool for developing these perspectives. This is joined to a political problem, one of persuading others to view the landscape in like manner. Anne is aware of this and reflects in the first novel that her inability to understand Sachs and vice versa is due to value systems based on entirely different assumptions, completely different kinds of science. As Sachs struggles to understand and reconcile his long-standing disagreement with Anne in the second novel, he suggests that their difference centers around the fact-value problem. Science concerns itself with facts and with theories that turn facts into examples. Values are another kind of system, a human construct. Despite the central problems, Anne quickly raises in response that science is also a human construct, and that it too has values embedded within its scientific method. Sachs insists that terraforming as applied science involves a choice of how to utilize the insights gained from science, and so is a value problem, whereas science and the scientific method itself is concerned only with facts. But by the third novel, Sachs modifies this view to articulate a vision of science as utopian and objective, a social construct, but also and most importantly its own space, conforming to reality only. That was its beauty. In a significant passage, Sachs describes how science is built on a method that privileges dialogue and adaptation, arguing that, in truth, the work of science was a communal thing, extending back even beyond the birth of modern science, back all the way into prehistory, as Michel had insisted, a constant struggle to understand. By the closing episodes of the trilogy, Sachs remains convinced that the communal practice of scientific inquiry, in this general sense, is the source of as much of the value of science as the facts and theories that it leads to. For Sachs, the practice of the scientific method is itself a participatory experience that has an affective dimension. This is a quote. Sachs feels something inside him that would glow till it hurt, some parasympathetic reaction spilling out of his limbic system. This was Martian science, in the hands of the scientists themselves, working together for some collective goal that made sense, that was for the common good. This image of the utopian impulse in science relocates the focus of the scientific utopia away from the construction of societal blueprints to one emphasizing a dialogical process, which scientific engagement with the natural world ramifies through social worlds. The Mars trilogy scrutinizes the structure of this scientific enclave and its communal goal, which, taken as a model, raises the question of its connection to the wider political sphere. In Red Mars, the radical socialist Arkady Bogdanov tells the charismatic pragmatist John Boone, both of them who are members of the first 100 scientists, that a scientific research station is actually a little model of prehistoric utopia carved out of the transnational money economy by clever primates who want to live well, and that their unwillingness to tackle the problem of working to create such conditions for everyone compromises its status as a genuine utopia. Sachs's scientific outlook changes in response to social upheaval. As the head of the terraforming project, and in his role as one of the mythic generals of the Martian Revolution for independence from Earth, Sachs is positioned at the forefront of a political struggle for defining Mars, forcing him to grapple as a scientist with the problem of the fact-value interface and of working to establish a foundation for the practice of science in a genuinely communal decision-making process. Suffering from aphasia after capture and torture in Green Mars, Sachs slowly recovers his linguistic ability alongside a new awareness of social interchange. He begins to consider the importance of other modes of understanding in Blue Mars. He considers symbolic value, a concept Sachs was trying very hard to understand. Adopted from a Greek word meaning throw together, it was alien to his understanding, this throwing together, a thing emotional and even unreal, and yet vitally important. Sachs's reflection on meaning takes him into the figurative realm, and his considerations lead him to combine his understanding of science with this notion of symbolic meaning, not to blur the boundaries of each, but to complement his experience of the world with another perspective. He makes connections between the throwing together of the symbol, the mind, ecology, and climatology, and uses metaphors drawn from the science underlying terraforming to suggest models that characterize the mind itself. He variously suggests that it is an ecology, a fell field, or else a jungle, populated by all manner of strange beasts, or chemical energy surging hither and yon like weather in an atmosphere. This is a long quote. That was better. Weather. Storm fronts of thought, high-pressure zones, low-pressure cells, hurricanes, the jet streams of biological desires, always making their swift, powerful rounds. Life in the wind. Well, thrown together. In fact, the mind was poorly understood. This metaphor for the mind utilizes the chaos-influenced science of meteorology in a manner that echoes Sargent's spatialization of Venus's hostile environment and its domes, all of which operate as metaphors for the mind turned inward. Ecology and climatology are figuratively aligned to the indeterminacy involved in analyses of the otherness of the human mind. Ecology begins to take on a figurative status as the science of throwing together, as it depends on a range of scientific and cultural disciplines to portray and grapple with the entirety of an ecological network that includes humanity and their adaptations to multiple environments. Rolston ends his paper by reflecting on various pre-scientific views of the environment, arguing that science should demythologize these views, but must itself find a new myth that encourages appropriate aesthetic responses to nature. It does not claim that traditional cultural responses to nature are detrimental or irrelevant, but that scientific understanding necessarily needs to demythologize them in order to be science. Just as Anne argues in Red Mars, Rawlston claims that humans are always the landscape architects, and even science is another cultural way of framing landscape. Terraforming, as a literature of landscaping, partakes of the throwing together theorized by Sachs, combining various scientific, political, and cultural parameters into the space of its thought experiment. It uses the dialogic structure of scientific inquiry, identified by Sachs, to construct an image of science that offers a variance to the imperial approaches to nature. The Science of the Venus trilogy also opens up reflection on the use of projects of applied science to enforce repressive, social, cultural, and political agendas. Both trilogies explore science's limits, and despite not explicating these specific connections in this paper, they investigate ways in which pre-scientific and scientific modes of understanding fuse. A paradigmatic example in the Mars trilogy is the evolution of a new envirocultural philosophy called the Areophony, the central tenet of which is we terraform the planet, but the planet area forms us. Terraforming narratives, then, concern themselves with the struggle of transformation, and it uses the sciences, especially ecology, to construct new myths for conceptualizing and relating to nature and society. Okay, thanks.